The rain hammered against the pavement like 1,000 tiny drummers, relentless and unforgiving. Beatrice Reed pushed through the hospital's automatic doors, her dark green scrubs already damp from the humidity that clung to the city. It had been 12 hours of back-to-back trauma cases, 2 codes and a family who couldn't understand why their grandmother wasn't responding to treatment. Her feet ached with a bone-deep weariness that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat, and her eyes burned from the fluorescent lights she'd been working under since before dawn. She fumbled in her bag for her phone, squinting at the screen through the sheets of water cascading from the hospital's awning. Her rideshare app showed a black sedan waiting in the pickup zone. Barely making out the shape of a dark vehicle idling 50 feet away, she pulled her jacket over her head and sprinted toward it. The car was sleek and expensive-looking, with tinted windows that revealed nothing of its interior. She yanked open the back door and threw herself inside, gasping with relief as the warmth of the heated seats enveloped her exhausted body. Thank God, she breathed, settling into a leather interior that smelled faintly of sandalwood. I thought I was going to drown out there. You can just take me to the apartment complex on the corner. She didn't wait for a response, already fishing for her earbuds as her eyes half closed against the dim lighting. The car was nicer than any rideshare she'd ever been in, but she was too tired to question it. Beatrice barely registered the figure sitting beside her as she buckled her seatbelt and let her head fall back. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, catching the profile of a man in a dark suit, his features sharp and angular in the shadows. She knew she should apologize for the intrusion or ask if it was a shared ride, but her body had other plans. The gentle hum of the engine and the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof conspired against her consciousness. Her eyelids grew impossibly heavy, and before she could form another coherent thought, she was fast asleep on the shoulder of Jae-hyun, a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts and governed the city's shadows with calculating ruthlessness. Inside the double doors of the City General Trauma Center, the air was a thick, stagnant mixture of industrial-grade disinfectant and the metallic tang of blood. Beatrice Reed stood at the central nursing station, her fingers hovering over a touchscreen that seemed to blur before her eyes. Every time she closed her eyelids, she saw the rhythmic, artificial pulse of a ventilator or the jagged green peaks of a cardiac monitor. Her gown, the standard-issue dark green scrubs that usually felt like a professional suit of armor, now felt like lead, dragging against her shoulders with the weight of every life she had touched since 6 a.m. The day had been a relentless conveyor belt of human crisis. It had started with a multi-car pileup on the interstate, followed immediately by a construction accident that had tested the very limits of her surgical precision. She could still feel the phantom vibration of the bone saw in her grip and the heat of the overhead surgical lamps that had baked the moisture from her skin. There was no room for ego in the ER, only the cold hard math of triage. Who could wait? Who was already gone? Dr. Reed, the labs for bed 4 are back, a junior resident muttered, passing her a tablet. Beatrice took it, her movements mechanical. She didn't need to look at the name to remember the patient, a young man with eyes full of terror who had gripped her hand so hard his knuckles turned white. She had spent 3 hours reconstructing his shattered femoral artery, whispering promises she wasn't entirely sure she could keep. By the time the sun had long since disappeared behind the storm clouds, Beatrice felt less like a person and more like a ghost haunting the hallways of her own career. Her iron will, the trait her colleagues both feared and admired, was fraying at the edges. She had skipped lunch, forgotten to drink water, and had spent her only 10-minute break comfort calling the daughter of a patient who hadn't made it out of the OR. The bureaucracy of the hospital was the final blow. The endless charting, the insurance authorizations, and the nagging feeling that for every person she saved, 3 more were falling through the cracks of a broken system. As she finally signed off on her last electronic chart, the clock on the wall mocked her. 12 hours and 14 minutes. She was a hollowed-out version of herself, a vessel that had given everything away until nothing but a dull, thrumming ache remained. When she finally stepped toward the exit, the weight of the gown felt heavy enough to crush her, her only remaining ambition being the simple, desperate need for silence. The automatic doors of the hospital hissed open, and the city's humidity hit Beatrice like a damp wool blanket. The storm had graduated from a drizzle to a full-scale assault, the rain coming down in vertical sheets that turned the streetlights into blurry halos of blue and amber. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She didn't have the mental energy to wait for a break in the clouds. She fumbled with her phone, her thumb sliding clumsily over the wet screen as she tracked the little car icon on her rideshare app. A black luxury sedan was idling in the designated Zone B pickup area, its headlights cutting through the deluge like two pale, searching eyes. 50 feet felt like a mile. She pulled her water-resistant windbreaker over her head, though it was a futile gesture against the torrential downpour, and sprinted. Her sneakers hit a deep puddle, sending a chill of muddy water through her socks, but she barely felt it. Her focus was entirely on the dark silhouette of the car. It was a sleek, imposing machine, its black paint gleaming like polished obsidian under the hospital's exterior lights. The windows were heavily tinted, a wall of dark glass that offered no glimpse of who might be inside. In her state of total cognitive depletion, she didn't stop to check the license plate or verify the driver's name. She just needed the world to stop moving for a while. Beatrice reached out and pulled the heavy door handle. The door opened with a muffled, expensive thud, revealing a cabin that looked more like a private jet than a standard commuter car. She threw herself into the back seat, the sudden silence of the interior cutting off the roar of the storm. "Thank God," she whispered, the words coming out as a shaky, exhausted sigh. As she pulled the door shut, the climate control immediately registered the drop in temperature. Within seconds, a wave of radiant heat began to seep through the premium black leather of the seat, warming her damp scrubs and soothing the dull ache in her lower back. The air inside didn't smell like the usual pine air fresheners or stale upholstery. It carried the faint, sophisticated scent of sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and a hint of something sharp and metallic. "I thought I was going to drown out there," she murmured to the back of the tinted partition, her eyes already slipping shut. "You can just head to the apartment complex on Maple Street. The one with the green gates." She didn't wait for an acknowledgement. She sank deeper into the plush seat, her head resting against the high-end headrest. The warmth was an intoxicating sedative, pulling her down into a dark, safe place where there were no pagers, no monitors, and no more lives to hold in her hands. She was so far gone that she didn't even notice the man sitting in the shadows right beside her, watching her with a stillness that was far more dangerous than the storm she had just escaped. Jae-hyun did not move. He sat in the velvet darkness of the sedan's passenger side, his body a study in lethal stillness. When the door had first been yanked open, his hand had already moved with practiced, liquid speed toward the handgun tucked into the door's side pocket. He had survived 3 assassination attempts in as many years. He lived in a world where an unexpected guest was almost always a harbinger of death. But the woman who had collapsed onto the heated leather beside him didn't smell like gunpowder or betrayal. She smelled of antiseptic, scorched coffee, and the salt of the rain. He watched her through narrowed, calculating eyes as she murmured an address to the partition and promptly surrendered to sleep. The interior lights, dimmed to a soft blue, caught the sharp line of her profile and the way her dark green scrubs were plastered to her skin. She looked fragile in her exhaustion, yet there was a stubborn strength in the set of her jaw that even sleep couldn't fully erase. His driver, Min-jun, caught his eye in the rearview mirror, his expression a silent question. "Should I remove her?" Jae-hyun stayed his hand with a single, infinitesimal shake of his head. He was fascinated by the sheer audacity of her mistake. In a city where men trembled at the mention of his name, this woman had walked into his private sanctuary and treated it like a refuge. There was something almost holy about her vulnerability, a purity of purpose that stood in stark contrast to the transactional violence of his own life. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the ID badge clipped to her waist. "Beatrice Reed, MD. Trauma surgery. A healer." He leaned back, the sandalwood scent of his cologne mingling with the dampness she had brought into the car. He could have woken her. He could have had her tossed back out into the unforgiving storm to wait for her actual ride. But for the first time in years, Jae-hyun felt a flicker of something other than suspicion. He felt a strange, protective curiosity. He watched the way her chest rose and fell in a deep, rhythmic slumber, her head eventually lurching to the side until it rested near his shoulder. "Drive," Jae-hyun commanded in a low, gravelly tone that barely rose above the hum of the engine. "Sir," Min-jun whispered. "The meeting with the council starts in 20 minutes. "Let them wait," Jae-hyun replied, his gaze never leaving the sleeping doctor. "Circle the city. Let her sleep for 45 minutes. Then take her to the address she gave." He didn't know why he was doing it. Perhaps it was because she was the only person in the city who didn't look at him with fear or greed. To her, in this moment of accidental grace, he was just a pair of heated seats and a safe place to land. He settled back into the shadows, a silent guardian to a woman who had no idea she was resting in the arms of the city's most dangerous man. The luxury sedan glided through the neon-blurred streets of the city, a silent shadow cutting through the silver veil of the storm. Inside, the world was reduced to the soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic heavy breathing of the woman beside Jae-hyun. Beatrice had surrendered completely to her exhaustion, her head eventually sliding from the headrest to rest near his shoulder. She was a dead weight of trust in a vehicle that usually carried only cold intentions. Jae-hyun remained motionless, allowing the strange weight of her presence to anchor him. He looked down at the plastic rectangular card clipped to the waistband of her dark green scrubs. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out, his long fingers grazing the fabric as he unclipped the hospital ID. He held it up to the faint blue glow of the dashboard lights, studying the face of the woman who had invaded his night. Beatrice Reed, MD. Senior Resident, Trauma Surgery. The photo showed a woman with the same sharp, intelligent eyes he had glimpsed before she drifted off, but in the picture, she looked alert, perhaps even a little defiant. He turned the card over in his hand, feeling the embossed letters. He knew the reputation of the hospital she'd just left. It was a war zone for the uninsured and the broken. To survive there for 12 hours required a specific kind of steel, a brand of courage that didn't rely on the weight of a firearm. He looked back at her, noting the faint purple shadows beneath her eyes and the way her hands, now limp in her lap, were calloused at the fingertips. These were hands that spent their days stitching life back together, while his spent their days deciding how much of it to tear away. The contrast was a physical ache in the quiet of the car. Min-jun glanced in the rearview mirror again, his eyes flickering to the clock. 30 minutes have passed, sir. We are currently circling the bay. Shall I head toward Maple Street? 15 more minutes, Jae-hyun replied, his voice a low vibration that didn't disturb the sleeper. Take the long way through the park. The roads are smoother there. He didn't care about the missed calls vibrating against his thigh or the restless lieutenants waiting for him in a boardroom across town. For these 45 minutes, the world of the Korean Mafia, the blood debts, the territory wars, and the constant crushing expectation of ruthlessness, didn't exist. There was only the rain against the glass, the scent of sandalwood, and the steady, warm heartbeat of a healer who had mistaken a predator for a protector. He clipped the badge back onto her scrubs with a lightness of touch that surprised even himself, watching her for a final moment before turning his gaze back to the dark, rain-streaked city. The transition from the deep, velvet abyss of sleep to reality was not a sudden jolt, but a slow, disorienting crawl. The first thing Beatrice registered was the silence, a heavy, expensive quiet that was a world away from the rhythmic beeping of the trauma ward. Then came the warmth, a steady heat that had seeped into her very bones, and the scent of sandalwood that felt far too sophisticated for a standard rideshare. Her eyelids felt like lead as she forced them open. For a heartbeat, she didn't move, her head still resting against a surface that was firm yet covered in fine wool. It took a second longer for her to realize the surface was a man's shoulder. Beatrice stiffened, the professional instincts of a surgeon snapping her into a state of high alert. She sat up abruptly, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The rain was still drumming against the roof, but the car was no longer moving. They were parked in the dim, golden glow of a street lamp outside her apartment complex. She turned her head, and the breath caught in her throat. Sitting mere inches away was the man she had glimpsed in the shadows. Up close, he was even more striking, his features carved with a lethal, aristocratic precision. His skin was pale against the darkness of his suit, and his dark hair was perfectly styled, save for a single strand that had fallen over his forehead. But it was his eyes that held her, dark obsidian depths that were entirely unreadable, watching her with a stillness that felt like a physical weight. Beatrice's hand went instinctively to the door handle, her clinical mind racing through the facts. This wasn't her Uber. The interior was too plush, the partition too thick, and the man beside her carried an aura of power that felt like a warning. I'm so sorry, she managed, her voice raspy from sleep and sudden adrenaline. She looked at the man, waiting for a flash of anger or a demand for an explanation. I must have the rain, the long shift. I thought this was my ride. Jae-hyun didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply studied her, his gaze dropping briefly to the medical ID still clipped to her waist before returning to her eyes. There was no judgment in his expression, only a terrifyingly calm curiosity. You were tired, Dr. Reed, he said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that vibrated through the small space, speaking her name with a familiarity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Beatrice froze. She hadn't told him her name. The realization that he had been watching her, studying her while she was vulnerable and unconscious, sent a shiver of ice through the heat of her veins. She was a woman who dealt with life and death every day, but looking into those unreadable eyes, she realized she had never been closer to the edge than she was right now. Beatrice's hand tightened on the door handle, her knuckles turning a ghostly white against her dark skin. The realization that this stranger knew her name, had likely spent the last 45 minutes studying her identity while she was unconscious, sent a jolt of pure, clinical adrenaline through her system. The exhaustion that had weighed her down moments ago was replaced by the sharp, cold clarity of a surgeon facing a sudden intraoperative hemorrhage. How do you know my name? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. She didn't wait for an answer, her eyes darting to the front of the car. The partition was still up, but she could see the silhouette of a driver, motionless and alert. I need to get out. Now. Your badge, Dr. Reed, Jae-hyun said, his voice as smooth as the silk of his tie. He didn't move toward her, yet his presence seemed to fill the entire cabin, pinning her in place. It was clipped to your waist. A senior resident in trauma surgery. It's a demanding life. One that apparently leaves little room for basic safety protocols. He leaned back slightly into the shadows, the blue dashboard light catching the glint of his luxury watch. You fell asleep on the shoulder of a man you don't know, in a car you didn't check. In my world, that is a fatal error. Beatrice finally looked at him fully, forcing herself to meet that obsidian gaze. She saw the danger there, the steel beneath the velvet of his expensive suit and soft words. She recognized the aura of a man who didn't just live in the city, but owned parts of it. And in my world, she countered, her voice dropping an octave, I spend 12 hours a day saving people who make fatal errors. Usually, they're the ones bleeding out on my table. I was tired. I made a mistake. But I don't think you're the type of man who kills people for being exhausted. A ghost of a smile touched Jae-hyun's lips, not one of warmth, but of genuine intrigue. You have a sharp tongue for a woman who just woke up in a predator's den. He gestured toward the window, where the familiar gates of her apartment complex stood just a few feet away. You are home, Beatrice. Safely. My driver has been circling the park to ensure your rest was undisturbed. The weight of the situation finally settled on her. He hadn't kidnapped her, he had protected her sleep. The realization was as confusing as it was terrifying. She pulled the handle, and the heavy door swung open, letting in the damp, cool air of the night. Why? She asked, pausing with one foot on the wet pavement. Because the city needs its surgeons, Jae-hyun replied, his eyes hooded and unreadable once more. And perhaps because I wanted to see what kind of woman carries the weight of so many lives without breaking. Beatrice didn't look back. She stepped out into the rain, the warmth of the car's interior lingering on her skin like a phantom touch. As the black sedan pulled away into the mist, she stood under the flickering street lamp, her heart finally slowing, wondering if she had just escaped a monster or encountered something much more complicated. The fluorescent lights of the surgical suite were as unforgiving as ever, humming with a sterile, electric intensity that usually signaled the beginning of Beatrice's focus. She stood at the scrub sink, the rhythmic friction of the sponge against her forearms a familiar ritual designed to wash away the outside world. But today, the heavy scent of the hospital's industrial iodine failed to do its job. Every time she breathed in, her mind betrayed her, conjuring the ghost of sandalwood and the faint, cold metallic tang of the black sedan. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself for the scheduled cholecystectomy, but the sensation of the car's radiant heat lingering on her skin was a phantom she couldn't shake. She could still feel the weight of Jae-hyun's presence, the way the air in that cabin had felt pressurized, thick with a power she didn't understand. The memory of his shoulder beneath her cheek was a burn she couldn't debride. It was a physical contradiction to everything she stood for, He was the shadow, and she was the light. He was the predator, and she was the healer. Yet, the safety she had felt in that car was more profound than any she had found in the guarded hallways of the hospital. "Dr. Reed. We're ready for you," the scrub nurse said, holding out a sterile towel. Beatrice snapped her eyes open, nodding sharply. She stepped into the OR, her movements precise, but as she reached for the scalpel, her senses remained heightened in a way that felt like a fever. The patient on the table was a stranger, yet for a fleeting second, she imagined the man from the car, wondering what kind of scars lay beneath his expensive wool suit, and what kind of violence it took to command a silence so absolute. Throughout the procedure, the sandalwood scent seemed to cling to the inside of her surgical mask, a persistent reminder of the 45 minutes she had spent in the lion's den. It was more than just a smell, it was an invitation to a world she had only ever seen from the safety of an ER bay. When the surgery was over and she stepped out into the recovery lounge, she found herself glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see a black silhouette idling at the curb. She was a woman of science and logic, a surgeon who dealt in the tangible and the proven. But as she sat in the break room, staring into a cup of lukewarm coffee, she realized the encounter hadn't just been a mistake of a wrong door. It had been a rupture in her reality. The city felt different now, no longer just a map of streets and trauma centers, but a vast, rain-soaked chessboard where a man with unreadable eyes watched from the dark. She was back in her world, surrounded by the familiar scent of antiseptic and coffee, but the lingering fragrance of sandalwood told her that the shadow had already left its mark. The 3 days following the encounter had passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Beatrice had leaned into the clinical rigidity of her life, burying herself in double shifts and complex consultations, trying to convince herself that the black sedan had been nothing more than a fever dream brought on by exhaustion. She had scrubbed the scent of sandalwood from her memory, or so she thought, until she stepped out of the hospital's main entrance on the third evening. The rain had finally ceased, leaving the city slick and reflecting the bruised purple of a dying sunset. There, idling in the exact same spot where she had made her mistake, was the obsidian black sedan. It didn't belong among the dented taxis and mid-range SUVs of the hospital carpool. It sat with a predatory patience, its engine a low rhythmic purr that Beatrice felt in the soles of her feet before she even reached the sidewalk. Her heart did a slow, heavy roll in her chest. She considered turning back, retreating into the sterile safety of the ER, but her feet seemed to move of their own accord. As she approached, the rear window remained dark, a wall of silence. However, the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, the same man she had seen through the partition. He was tall, dressed in a sharp, understated black suit, his expression a mask of professional neutrality. "Dr. Reed," he said, bowing his head just enough to acknowledge her. He didn't use a tone of command, yet the air around him felt heavy with the authority of the man he served. "What is this?" Beatrice asked, her voice sounding small against the backdrop of city traffic. She gripped the strap of her medical bag, her knuckles tightening. "I told him I made a mistake. I don't owe him anything." "Mr. Kong does not believe in debts, doctor," the driver replied, reaching for the rear door handle. "He believes in opportunities. He was impressed by your composure, and he has a proposition he would like to discuss with you. Privately." Beatrice looked at the dark glass of the rear window. She couldn't see Jae-hyun, but she could feel him, that same pressurized stillness that had enveloped her 3 nights ago. Logic screamed at her to walk away, to call a real car and go home to her quiet, safe apartment. But the iron will, that made her a great surgeon, was laced with a dangerous streak of curiosity. She was a woman who lived for the high stakes of the operating room, and the shadow at the curb represented a mystery she wasn't sure she could leave unsolved. "I have a shift in 12 hours, she said, her voice gaining a sharp, defensive edge. "You will be back in 2, the driver promised, pulling the door open. The interior of the car was exactly as she remembered. The warmth, the scent, the invitation into a world that existed beneath the surface of the one she knew. Beatrice took a long, steadying breath, the antiseptic of the hospital still clinging to her skin, and stepped into the shadow once more. The interior of the sedan felt even more intimate the second time, the plush leather yielding to Beatrice's weight as the door clicked shut, sealing out the city's roar. Jae-hyun was there, a silhouette of tailored charcoal wool and quiet gravity. He didn't speak until the car was in motion, the tires humming a low, expensive song against the damp asphalt. "You look tired again, doctor," he said, his voice a dark silk that seemed to vibrate in the small space. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the passing blur of neon lights. "The hospital is a machine that grinds fine things into dust. You are a senior resident, yet you spend your talent filling out forms and begging for resources that should be yours by right." Beatrice shifted, her clinical mind instantly analyzing his tone. It wasn't pity, it was an observation of inefficiency. "It's called public service," she countered, though the weariness in her bones made the words feel heavy. "We save the people the rest of the world forgets. And what if you didn't have to choose between the two?" Jae-hyun finally turned to her, his obsidian eyes catching a flash of passing streetlights. "I have a facility. State-of-the-art. Diagnostic equipment your chief of surgery would envy. It is private, discreet, and entirely outside the reach of the city's bureaucracy." He leaned forward slightly, the scent of sandalwood intensifying. "I am offering you a clinic of your own, Dr. Reed. You will have a staff of your choosing, a budget with no ceiling, and the freedom to practice medicine without the interference of insurance adjusters or hospital boards." Beatrice felt a cold prickle of apprehension. She knew there was no such thing as a free gift in this city, especially not from a man who traveled with a partition and a silent driver. "And the price? I imagine your discreet patients aren't coming in for routine physicals." "My people live in the shadows," Jae-hyun admitted, his expression remaining unreadable. "They sustain injuries that cannot be reported to the police. They require the hands of a surgeon who can keep a secret as well as she can tie a suture. You would be their guardian. In exchange, you can use the facility to treat whoever you wish, the forgotten, the undocumented, the poor, on my dime." It was a devil's bargain, wrapped in the promise of a medical utopia. Beatrice looked out the window, her mind racing through the ethical minefield. It was a moral gray area, so vast she couldn't see the edges. To accept was to step out of the light of the law and into the pocket of the underground. "I have conditions," she said, her voice dropping to a low, determined frequency. "I don't treat anyone who is currently a threat to others. And I don't hide bodies. I am a healer, not a cleaner." Jae-hyun watched her, a slow, predatory respect dawning in his eyes. "I expected nothing less from a woman with your iron will. Think on it, Beatrice. The clinic is ready. The only thing missing is the heart to run it." The car didn't stop at a hospital or a commercial office park. Instead, it glided into the freight elevator of an unassuming industrial warehouse on the edge of the river district. As the lift hummed upward, the gritty, oil-stained walls of the warehouse fell away, replaced by a sleek, pressurized vestibule that smelled of ozone and high-end air filtration. When the doors slid open, Beatrice stepped out into a world that felt like a fever dream of modern medicine. The facility was a masterpiece of subterranean architecture. Polished white floors stretched toward walls of frosted glass, illuminated by recessed blue lighting that mimicked a calm, perpetual twilight. There were no crowded waiting rooms, no flickering fluorescent tubes, and none of the frantic, desperate energy of the ER. Instead, there was a profound, expensive silence. Jae-hyun walked beside her, his hands clasped loosely behind his back as they passed a diagnostic bay equipped with a high Tesla MRI machine and a robotic surgical suite that Beatrice had only ever seen in medical journals. "The imaging is linked to a private satellite network," Jae-hyun noted, his voice echoing softly. "The pharmacy is fully stocked with everything from basic antibiotics to experimental clotting agents not yet approved for general use. Everything here is yours to command." Beatrice ran a hand over the cold, brushed steel of a surgical console. The sheer power of the technology was intoxicating, a surgeon's ultimate playground, but the weight of the why pulled at her. She turned to face him, her silhouette sharp against the glow of the monitors. "It's a sanctuary," she admitted, her voice low and steady. "But I need to be clear about the boundaries of this temple, Jae-hyun. I am a doctor. My hands are for healing, not for hiding the consequences of your business. I have 3 conditions that are non-negotiable." Jae-hyun stopped, turning his full attention toward her. The obsidian depths of his eyes were unreadable, but he waited for her to speak with a stillness that felt like respect. "First," Beatrice began, counting off on her fingers. I will never be asked to take a life. If a patient is beyond saving, I provide comfort, not a solution. Second, I am not a vault. If I see evidence of a crime against a child or someone truly innocent, I will not be silenced by your payroll. And third, she stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and antiseptic colliding in the narrow space between them. This facility remains open to the people of this neighborhood on the weekends. No questions asked, no fees charged. Your shadows pay for the light I give to the rest. Jae-hyun watched her for a long moment, the blue light of the clinic catching the sharp, dangerous angles of his face. He didn't blink, didn't recoil at her demands. Instead, he took a step into her personal space, his presence a heavy, warm pressure. You speak of light and shadow as if they are separate, Beatrice, he murmured. But in this city, one cannot exist without the other. I accept your terms. Not because I am a good man, but because I believe you are a great doctor. He held out a slim, black keycard. As she took it, her fingers brushed his, a brief spark of contact that sent a shiver of both fear and resolve down her spine. The sanctuary was hers, but the price was a permanent seat at the table of the city's most dangerous man. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 11, Patience in the Dark, where Beatrice treats her first underground patient? The car didn't stop at a hospital or a commercial office park. Instead, it glided into the freight elevator of an unassuming industrial warehouse on the edge of the river district. As the lift hummed upward, the gritty, oil-stained walls of the warehouse fell away, replaced by a sleek, pressurized vestibule that smelled of ozone and high-end air filtration. When the doors slid open, Beatrice stepped out into a world that felt like a fever dream of modern medicine. The facility was a masterpiece of subterranean architecture. Polished white floors stretched toward walls of frosted glass, illuminated by recessed blue lighting that mimicked a calm, perpetual twilight. There were no crowded waiting rooms, no flickering fluorescent tubes, and none of the frantic, desperate energy of the ER. Instead, there was a profound, expensive silence. Jae-hyun walked beside her, his hands clasped loosely behind his back as they passed a diagnostic bay equipped with a high Tesla MRI machine and a robotic surgical suite that Beatrice had only ever seen in medical journals. The imaging is linked to a private satellite network, Jae-hyun noted, his voice echoing softly. The pharmacy is fully stocked with everything from basic antibiotics to experimental clotting agents not yet approved for general use. Everything here is yours to command. Beatrice ran a hand over the cold, brushed steel of a surgical console. The sheer power of the technology was intoxicating, a surgeon's ultimate playground, but the weight of the why pulled at her. She turned to face him, her silhouette sharp against the glow of the monitors. It's a sanctuary, she admitted, her voice low and steady. But I need to be clear about the boundaries of this temple, Jae-hyun. I am a doctor. My hands are for healing, not for hiding the consequences of your business. I have 3 conditions that are non-negotiable. Jae-hyun stopped, turning his full attention toward her. The obsidian depths of his eyes were unreadable, but he waited for her to speak with a stillness that felt like respect. First, Beatrice began, counting off on her fingers. I will never be asked to take a life. If a patient is beyond saving, I provide comfort, not a solution. Second, I am not a vault. If I see evidence of a crime against a child or someone truly innocent, I will not be silenced by your payroll. And third, she stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and antiseptic colliding in the narrow space between them. This facility remains open to the people of this neighborhood on the weekends. No questions asked, no fees charged. Your shadows pay for the light I give to the rest. Jae-hyun watched her for a long moment, the blue light of the clinic catching the sharp, dangerous angles of his face. He didn't blink, didn't recoil at her demands. Instead, he took a step into her personal space, his presence a heavy, warm pressure. You speak of light and shadow as if they are separate, Beatrice, he murmured. But in this city, one cannot exist without the other. I accept your terms. Not because I am a good man, but because I believe you are a great doctor. He held out a slim, black keycard. As she took it, her fingers brushed his, a brief spark of contact that sent a shiver of both fear and resolve down her spine. The sanctuary was hers, but the price was a permanent seat at the table of the city's most dangerous man. The transition from the frantic high-decibel chaos of the City General ER to the hushed, pressurized stillness of the shadow clinic was jarring. Beatrice stood in her new sanctuary, the white tile floor reflecting the soft blue glow of the overhead monitors. She had expected her first underground patients to be hardened men with jagged scars and bullet wounds, the foot soldiers of Jaehyun's empire. Instead, when the private elevator hummed open, she found herself staring at a terrified young mother clutching a toddler whose skin was a worrying shade of gray. "He won't stop coughing," the woman whispered, her eyes darting toward the silent, suit-clad man standing by the door. "We can't go to the hospital. My papers. My husband's status." Beatrice moved instinctively, her clinical mind overriding the strangeness of the setting. She took the child into her arms, noting the heat radiating from his small body. "You're safe here," she said, her voice dropping into the low, soothing register she used for her most frightened patients. "I am Dr. Reed. Let's get him onto the table." As she worked, the high-tech silence of the clinic became an ally. There were no sirens, no shouting residents, and no bureaucratic red tape. She had every diagnostic tool at her fingertips, yet the medicine felt more personal than anything she had practiced in years. She wasn't just treating a respiratory infection, she was treating a family that the city had decided was invisible. Throughout the night, the elevator continued its silent ascent. A grandmother with advanced diabetes who had been rationing her insulin because she couldn't afford the copay. A construction worker with a crushed hand who feared that a formal hospital report would cost him his under-the-table job. They were the ordinary people living in Jaehyun's extraordinary world, those who existed in the cracks of the system and had found a guardian in the dark. Jaehyun appeared in the doorway near dawn, his presence a silent shadow against the pristine white walls. He didn't speak, but he watched as Beatrice finished bandaging the worker's hand, her movements precise and full of a grace that had nothing to do with vanity. When the last patient had been escorted out, Beatrice leaned against the brushed steel counter, her eyes stinging with a familiar exhaustion, but her heart felt curiously light. She looked at Jaehyun, the scent of sandalwood and ozone hanging in the air between them. "This wasn't what I expected," she admitted, stripping off her latex gloves. "The shadows are wider than you think, Beatrice," Jaehyun replied, stepping into the room. "Most people think my world is built only on blood. They forget it is also built on loyalty. And loyalty is earned by protecting those the light ignores." Beatrice realized then that she wasn't just a doctor in a Mafia clinic. She was the bridge between two worlds, and for the first time in her career, she wasn't just fighting to keep people alive, she was fighting to give them a place where they finally mattered. The clinic was silent, the high-tech hum of the diagnostic machines providing a rhythmic backdrop to the end of another long night. Beatrice was documenting her last patient's charts when the scent reached her. Not the sharp sting of alcohol or the metallic tang of the lab, but the rich, earthy aroma of braised short ribs and toasted sesame. She looked up to find Jaehyun standing in the doorway of her small office, his jacket discarded and his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that hinted at a strength his tailored suits usually concealed. He didn't ask if she was hungry, he simply set a lacquered tiffin carrier on her desk. "You haven't eaten since 1400 hours, Beatrice. Even a surgeon's iron will requires fuel." He moved with a quiet, domestic grace that felt entirely foreign in this sanctuary of steel and glass. As he unpacked the containers, delicate banchan, steaming rice, and perfectly glazed galbi, the clinical distance between them began to dissolve. Beatrice hesitated, then cleared her workspace, the stacks of medical journals replaced by the warmth of a shared meal. They ate in a comfortable, low-frequency silence at first, the only sound the soft click of chopsticks. It was the first time Beatrice had seen him truly still, without a driver at his back or a phone vibrating with the demands of his empire. In the soft glow of the desk lamp, the dangerous edges of his persona seemed to soften, revealing the man beneath the myth. "Why do you do it?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the quiet. "The clinic. The charity. You could have just hired a private doctor for your men." Jaehyun paused, his gaze fixed on her. "Because most people only see the power. You see the person. When you fell asleep in my car, you weren't looking for a boss or a criminal. You were just looking for a place to rest. I find I enjoy being that for you." The air in the room suddenly felt pressurized, thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the deception of their arrangement and everything to do with the proximity of their souls. Beatrice felt a flush crawl up her neck that had nothing to do with the spicy kimchi. When she reached for the water carafe, her fingers brushed against his. Instead of pulling away, Jae-hyun let his hand linger, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her wrist. The contact was electric. Her heart, usually so steady under the pressure of a trauma bay, skipped a beat. For a long, suspended moment, the reality of who he was, and the danger of who she was becoming, faded into the background. There was only the heat of his skin and the unreadable, dark intensity of his eyes. The deception was no longer in the clinic's existence, but in the lie she told herself, that this was strictly professional. As he leaned in slightly, the scent of sandalwood enveloping her, Beatrice realized the boundaries were gone, replaced by a gravity she was no longer sure she wanted to fight. The transition from treating the invisible poor to the violent underworld happened on a Tuesday, at 3 o'clock in the morning. The quiet of the clinic was shattered not by a scream, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of the freight elevator. When the doors opened, 2 men in dark suits stepped out, supporting a third between them. He was young, barely 20, with a leather jacket that looked too big for his frame. He caught a stray piece of glass, one of the men said, his voice tight with a forced, artificial calm. A bar fight that got out of hand. Just fix him up, document. Beatrice moved with her usual clinical efficiency, guiding them to the primary trauma bay. The young man was pale, his breathing shallow and thready. As she began to cut away the heavy leather of his sleeve, she expected the jagged, irregular lacerations of a bottle or a window. Instead, as the fabric fell away, she saw a neat, circular entry wound in the lateral aspect of his bicep, clean, blackened at the edges, and oozing a steady, dark crimson. Her hands stilled for a fraction of a second. She didn't need a radiograph to know what she was looking at. This wasn't glass. It was a small caliber round, likely a .22, and the exit wound was nowhere to be found. This is a gunshot, Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous frequency. She looked up at the 2 men, who had moved to flank the door. You lied to me. Just fix it, doctor, the taller one replied, his hand moving subtly toward the small of his back. That's what you're here for, isn't it? No questions asked. The iron will, that had carried Beatrice through 1,000 trauma shifts flared. She didn't flinch. She stepped away from the table, her gloved hands held up in a gesture of icy defiance. My agreement with Jae-hyun was clear. I am a healer, not a co-conspirator. I treat the wounded, but I do not accept the deception. If you want me to save his arm, you tell me the truth. Now. The tension in the room was a physical weight, thick with the scent of ozone and copper. For a long moment, it seemed the men might choose force over cooperation. But then, the shadow in the corner moved. Jae-hyun stepped into the light, his expression a mask of cold, terrifying displeasure directed not at Beatrice, but at his own men. She asked you a question, Jae-hyun said, his voice a low vibration that made the air in the clinic feel brittle. The tall man swallowed hard, his bravado vanishing instantly. It was an ambush at the docks, sir. The North Side crew. We didn't want to. We thought the glass story would be easier. Jae-hyun turned his gaze to Beatrice. The obsidian depth of his eyes was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps an apology, or perhaps a warning. The truth has been told, Beatrice. Now, save him. Beatrice didn't look back at him. She reached for the tray of sterile instruments, the first bullet of her new life sitting heavy in her tray. The moral gray area had just turned a much darker shade of red. The shadow of the clinic followed Beatrice back into the world of the living, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a target. For 2 weeks, the weight of the first bullet had stayed with her, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach that not even the rhythmic scrubbing of her hands before surgery could wash away. She had become a woman of 2 lives, and the friction between them was starting to throw sparks. It began with a silver SUV. She first noticed it in the reflection of a storefront window as she walked from the hospital to her favorite coffee shop, a nondescript vehicle that slowed to a crawl half a block behind her. She dismissed it as the hypervigilance of a woman who had spent too many nights in a subterranean bunker. But then, she saw it again. 2 days later, the same silver silhouette was idling at the edge of the park where she sat to clear her head. It was always there, just at the periphery of her vision, a silent predator masquerading as traffic. Beatrice didn't call Jae-hyun. Her pride, that iron will that had defined her career, refused to let her run to him at the first sign of a shadow. Instead, she tested it. Leaving her night shift at City General, she detoured through a crowded subway station, doubling back through a service corridor she knew from her intern days. Emerging on the other side, she stepped into the humid night air, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. A man was standing under a flickering street lamp across the way. He wasn't wearing a tailored wool suit or carrying the sophisticated scent of sandalwood. He was dressed in a heavy work jacket, his face partially obscured by the brim of a dark cap, but the way he watched her was unmistakable. It wasn't the curious, protective gaze of Jae-hyun, it was the cold, calculating stare of a man measuring a weakness. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was no longer just a surgeon. To the rest of the city, she was a piece of Jae-hyun's infrastructure. She was the one who kept his soldiers on the field. She was his secret, and in the violent mathematics of the underworld, the easiest way to hurt a king was to strike at his healer. As she hurried toward her apartment, her keys clutched between her knuckles like a makeshift weapon, the air felt thick with a new kind of danger. The city she had once walked with the confidence of a woman who saved lives now felt like a labyrinth of trapdoors. She reached her door and leaned against the wood, gasping for breath as the silence of her hallway mocked her. She was being watched by people who didn't care about medical ethics or no-kill conditions. The moral gray area had finally collapsed, leaving her standing alone in the dark, caught in the crosshairs of a war she hadn't realized she was fighting. The storm had returned to the city with a vengeance, a violent reprise of the night Beatrice had first entered the wrong car. Inside the clinic, the silence was no longer peaceful, it was heavy, vibrating with the low-frequency rumble of thunder that shook the foundation of the warehouse. Beatrice was restocking the trauma cart, her hands steady despite the lingering paranoia of being followed, when the freight elevator didn't just hum, it screamed. The metal doors hit the stops with a bone-jarring crash. Min-jun stumbled out, his usually immaculate suit shredded and soaked through with a terrifying amount of crimson. He wasn't walking, he was dragging the weight of a man whose life was visibly leaking onto the pristine white floor. "Doctor." Min-jun's voice was a ragged, desperate plea she had never heard from him. They hit the motorcade. 3 blocks out. He's not breathing right. Beatrice's clinical mind overrode the scream in her chest the moment she saw Jae-hyun. The man who governed the city's shadows looked hauntingly small, his face the color of wet ash. His white dress shirt was no longer white, it was a sodden, heavy mask of blood. "Get him on the table. Now," she commanded, her voice cutting through Min-jun's panic like a scalpel. As they hoisted him onto the surgical bed, the metallic tang of blood overwhelmed the scent of sandalwood. Beatrice ripped open his shirt, her eyes scanning the damage with the cold, rapid-fire precision of a trauma lead. 2 entry wounds in the upper quadrant, one near the clavicle, the other dangerously close to the midline. The sucking sound of a tension pneumothorax whistled through the quiet room, a herald of impending cardiac arrest. "He's crashing," she muttered, grabbing a large-bore needle for a chest decompression. As the hiss of escaping air signaled a temporary reprieve, she looked at his face. Jae-hyun's eyes fluttered open for a fraction of a second, unfocused and glazed with shock. His hand, cold and trembling, reached out and brushed against her scrub top, leaving a dark, smeared handprint over her heart. "Beatrice." He choked out, a scarlet foam bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Don't talk. Look at me, Jae-hyun." "Stay with me," she snapped, though her own heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. This wasn't just a patient. This was the man who had protected her sleep, who had fed her in the dark, and who had become the gravity in her fractured world. The monitors began a shrill, rhythmic warning, a flatline in the making. Outside, the rain hammered against the warehouse roof like 1,000 tiny drummers, but inside, the only sound that mattered was the fading pulse of the King of Shadows. Beatrice grabbed the scalpel, her iron will narrowing down to a single point of focus. She wasn't just a surgeon tonight, she was a woman fighting to pull her own heart back from the edge of the abyss. The silence of the clinic was replaced by the rhythmic, frantic chirping of the anesthesia monitor. Beatrice moved with a cold, terrifying clarity, her surgical gown pulled on over her blood-stained scrubs, her gloves snapping against her wrists like a declaration of war. On the table, Jae-hyun was a map of trauma, his life force ebbing into the sterile drapes. The iron will that had defined her career was now the only thing keeping her hands from shaking as she made the first incision. The surgery was a descent into a labyrinth of damaged tissue and hidden hemorrhages. The first bullet had nicked the subclavian artery, creating a pool of darkness that obscured everything. Beatrice worked by feel as much as by sight, her fingers dancing through the scarlet depths to clamp the vessel. Every time the monitor's heart rate slowed to a thready, agonizing crawl, she felt a corresponding chill in her own chest. This wasn't just a clinical exercise. It was a battle for the soul of the man who had seen her when she was invisible. Suction, she commanded, her voice a sharp, unwavering blade. Minjun, stay back. Watch the pressure. As she moved deeper into the chest cavity, she found the second projectile lodged dangerously close to the spine. The room smelled of copper and ozone, the air thick with the weight of the impossible. She had performed this surgery 100 times on strangers, but the intimacy of the task now felt like a heavy shroud. She could see the faint lines around Jae-hyun's eyes even in his unconscious state, the marks of a man who carried the weight of an empire. Minutes stretched into an hour of grueling precision. She navigated the delicate web of nerves and vessels, her focus narrowing until the entire world was reduced to the few square inches of his open chest. When she finally retrieved the jagged piece of lead, the sound of it dropping into the metal tray was the loudest thing in the room. Hemostasis achieved, she whispered, more to herself than to the silent men watching from the shadows. She began the long process of closing, her sutures as even and beautiful as fine embroidery. As the monitor stabilized into a steady, rhythmic beep, a mechanical heartbeat reclaiming the silence, Beatrice finally allowed herself to breathe. She leaned her forehead against the cool steel of the surgical light for a brief second, the adrenaline receding to leave a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. She had pulled the King of Shadows back from the threshold, but as she looked down at his pale, still face, she knew the price of saving him was that she was now, irrevocably, a part of his darkness. The fourth day of Jae-hyun's recovery brought a fragile, translucent dawn that filtered through the high, reinforced windows of the clinic. The steady, rhythmic hum of the heart monitor had become the soundtrack to Beatrice's life, a mechanical pulse that mirrored her own exhaustion. She was adjusting the fore-drip, her fingers hovering over the plastic tubing. When she felt a dry, calloused hand wrap around her wrist, Jae-hyun was awake. His eyes, usually obsidian shields of unreadable intent, were clouded with the haze of high-grade analgesics and the lingering shadow of the abyss. He didn't let go. His grip was weak, a ghost of the strength he usually commanded, but the desperation in it was a physical weight. "You should be resting," Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking. "The internal sutures are still fresh." "The sutures hold the flesh, Beatrice. They do nothing for the rest," he rasped, his voice a jagged tear in the silence. He looked away from her, toward the sterile white ceiling that offered no absolution. "You saved a man who has spent 15 years ensuring others didn't have the same luxury. You see a sanctuary here, but I see a ledger. And the ink is almost entirely red." Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed, the iron will that had carried her through his surgery now bending under the gravity of his words. She didn't pull her hand away. "I have ordered deaths to prevent wars," he continued, the words spilling out like a slow, toxic hemorrhage. "I have burned down neighborhoods to protect the borders of an empire I never truly wanted. I have watched men beg for lives I had already decided were forfeit. I am not the protector you want to believe I am. I am the reason the shadows exist in the first place." The confession was a deliberate act of self-destruction, a way of pushing her back toward the light before she was completely consumed by his world. He told her of the betrayals, the blood-soaked negotiations, and the cold, mathematical cruelty it took to remain the king of a city that ate the weak. He was stripping away the velvet, leaving only the jagged, rusted steel of his past. Beatrice listened, her heart hammering a heavy, mournful rhythm. She saw the scars on his soul that no scalpel could reach, the necrotic tissue of a conscience that had been forced to survive in the dark. "I know what you've done," she said finally, her voice steady and resonant in the small room. She leaned over him, her face inches from his, the scent of antiseptic and sandalwood finally merging into a single, complex truth. "I've seen the damage. But I also saw the mother and the child you sent to me. I saw the people you protected when the city turned its back. You are a monster to some, Jae-hyun. To me, you are a patient. And I don't give up on my patients. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady thud of the life she had fought to keep. The confession hadn't driven her away, it had simply mapped the territory they were now destined to navigate together. A world where the light and the shadow were no longer separate, but inextricably bound. The morning sun fought its way through the industrial haze of the river district, casting long, slanted bars of amber light across the clinic's recovery suite. Beatrice stood by the window, watching the city wake up, a distant, frantic world of sirens and crowded subways that felt like a lifetime away. Behind her, the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator had long since been replaced by the steady, quiet breathing of a man who had cheated death. She looked down at her hands. They were clean now, the scrubbed skin pale and smelling of surgical soap, but she could still feel the phantom heat of Jae-hyun's blood. She thought of City General, of the promotion that surely awaited her, and the safe, predictable life of a celebrated surgeon in the light. It was a life of accolades and exhaustion, of saving strangers who would never know her name. Then she turned back to the man in the bed. Jae-hyun was watching her, his dark eyes clear and focused, though the pain of his recovery etched deep lines around his mouth. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. He was giving her the one thing he rarely offered anyone, a choice. The heavy black keycard sat on the bedside table between them, a silent invitation to stay or a passport back to the world she knew. If you walk out that door, Beatrice, the silver SUV will never follow you again, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. I will scrub your name from every ledger I own. You can be the doctor the world expects you to be. Beatrice walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the polished floor. She didn't look at the keycard. She looked at the man who had bared his soul in the dark, showing her the jagged, broken pieces of a life spent in the shadows. The iron will that had always guided her wasn't pulling her toward the hospital's fluorescent halls. It was anchoring her right here, in the gray space where the light and the dark met. The world has enough doctors who follow the rules, Jae-hyun, she said, her voice steady and resonant. She sat beside him, her hand finding his, not as a healer checking a pulse, but as a woman claiming her place. But this city, it needs someone who isn't afraid of the dark. And I think I've spent too long trying to pretend I don't belong in it. The danger was no longer an abstract threat, it was a permanent shadow, a debt that would likely never be paid in full. There would be more bullets, more secrets, and more nights where the rain felt like a shroud. But as Jae-hyun pulled her hand to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers, Beatrice realized that the safety she had once craved was a pale imitation of the fire she felt now. She wasn't just his surgeon, and he wasn't just her patient. They were architects of a new world, built on the ruins of their old lives. She reached out and picked up the black keycard, tucking it into the pocket of her scrubs. The choice was made. The surgeon had found her sanctuary, and it was in the heart of the storm. The story of Beatrice and Jae-hyun serves as a powerful exploration of the complexities of morality. It challenges the traditional binary of good versus evil and light versus shadow. If you enjoyed this descent into the shadows and the high-stakes world of Beatrice and Jae-hyun, don't miss out on what happens next. Subscribe now to stay updated on new chapters, character deep dives, and more stories that explore the thin line between right and wrong. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a beat of the heart-pounding drama.